Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Our friend TJ is with us by FaceTime this week, and she's got some questions. TJ?
Hi Dale, happy Curious American Quarantine Edition. I am very interested this week in what's going on at the provincial level in terms of politics. There's been a lot of increased media coverage of what premiers are saying and what it implies and how it differs, this and that, from the federal perspectives. And also, a lot of conversation I've seen is around the apparently unexpected level of cooperation that is occurring both between premiers and between premiers and the federal government. And it made me want to know a bit more about what are the usual partisan instincts, policies, etc. that they are having to control in order to do this sort of Team Canada approach.
Okay. I think the first thing is largely that the configuration of the provinces politically has changed since Trudeau first became Prime Minister. So when he first got elected, there was a lot more Liberal premiers around the country than there are currently. And that's kind of shifted some of the dynamic. And there are some premiers in particular who've been fairly antagonistic to Trudeau, and many of them are playing nice now, so I think that's largely what you're hearing about.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very interesting. And the evolution of that through the pandemic, do you see that impacting the sort of what's called the success of those premiers as leaders of their own provinces?
I think it's going to be interesting to see, because part of what's been going on is the federal government's been taking on a fairly increasingly heavy role, and everyone is asking the Prime Minister to do things that are typically in provincial jurisdiction, like the whole thing with rent subsidies, for example. They keep asking the Prime Minister to do that even though it's explicitly a provincial matter, and when they went and created this commercial rent subsidy program, they had to do that with the provinces on board. And so that's partially why the rules are as restrictive for that program as they are, is because that's all that the provinces would agree to. So that's one of the kind of interesting things that's been happening. And now with the question around long-term care coming out of this, we're also seeing this notion about some premiers saying, this is our jurisdiction, we really don't want you to meddle in this. And that's going to be one of the kind of longer term fights that comes out of this.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm seeing and understanding from what you're saying as well, this increased pressure on the government to answer morally almost for the decisions that are being made that are either quote-unquote watered down from what the federal government wanted to do, or that are just not satisfactory to people. And it's interesting that this policy structural issue is actually affecting the way people hold their government to account.
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting to see, because people don't necessarily always understand what jurisdictional issues are. So I think that could be interesting how this plays out in the longer term. How much of the, I guess, the fallout from this issue rests on the federal government versus each provincial government. Some provinces have been more responsive to things than others, and I think that that could be something that, come the next election in any of these provinces, we'll see. Hard to say.
And in terms of this shift in composition of Liberal premiers to now, over the course of Trudeau's incumbency, the Liberal Party, from what I understand, at provincial levels, is more similar to the federal party of the Liberals than the Conservatives are? Or how does this all how do we compare all of this?
We can't really, because provincial and federal parties are different beasts entirely. So not every provincial Liberal Party is analogous to the federal Liberal Party. And in many provinces, they don't have a Liberal Party or they don't have a Conservative Party, and they've got some local homegrown version thereof. So it's interesting to see how, I guess from your perspective, a Democrat is a Democrat and a Republican is a Republican. Whereas in Canada, a Liberal in Ontario and a Liberal in Quebec can mean very different things.
Yes, that is a very interesting wrinkle on it, is a lack of ability to make a comparison in the first place. And when you combine that with what we were discussing earlier about general confusion over jurisdictional issues, yeah, that is definitely one of the things that has confounded me a bit in trying to understand some of these longer think pieces that we've seen around, etc., which are quote-unquote laying blame and praise in dramatic ways.
Yeah. So, I mean, you and I have touched on this before, but the federal parties and provincial parties are largely different beasts. The NDP claims that, federal and provincial are essentially the same party. If you buy one membership, you buy one for both levels. It's not really the same for the other parties. And the NDP, even there, many of their provincial parties are less doctrinaire in many respects than the federal one. The case in point, especially being in Alberta, where, there was a distinct fight between the federal and the provincial parties, because the provincial one was far more pragmatic when they were in government, whereas that's not, what they, the positions they were taking federally would have had grave consequences provincially, particularly around things like the oil sector and so on, and pipelines and all of that. In other it did once upon a time used to be, the parties were the same. If you, in certain parts of the country, if you bought a federal Liberal membership, it also applied provincially or vice versa. But those days are over. Partially, and it had kind of been phasing out across the country, and then the stake through the heart of that was when the federal party abolished memberships entirely. So it has a completely different structure now to how these parties work provincially.
Is this something that will continue to evolve, or have we gone through in this decade, whatever century, a period of change and adjustment that you think is going to stabilize?
It's constantly evolving, partially because in some provinces, the most recent example being Alberta, where their progressive conservative party provincially, being a holdover of the old progressive conservatives, which are extinct federally, merged with another right-leaning party provincially and became the United Conservative Party.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. In BC, their Conservative Party merged with their provincial Liberal Party, and they became the BC Liberals, which are more right-leaning than centrist, like the federal Liberals are. In Quebec, the Quebec Liberal Party is the federalist alternative to the separatist provincial party, which being the Parti Québécois. So a Quebec Liberal is kind of all over the map ideologically. Their last, second last leader and long-serving premier was a former federal progressive conservative.
Wow.
So it's kind of a mash across the country as to what your local flavor is. And
I liked the word you used, extinct, because it's actually helping me think of this almost as like a genetic evolution process with branching off lines and then lines that die, as opposed to the US one where, for example, a Texan Democrat might have some distinct differences from a Californian Democrat, but even within that, one basically has to choose, in order to exert any power, participation within a sort of a larger network, almost more a sprawling type of organism that you have to either be a part of or be a part of its other. And here, it really sounds like perhaps it's going back to the natural selection idea, it seems like it's more able to respond to the needs of people who participate in it.
I think it's also the multi-party nature of our system, because even within the Democrats, for example, you've got, the Bernie side versus the, the Biden side, I guess. And there can be a fairly wide gulf between them. And they're all Democrats, but not, they would be separate parties if they were in Canada. Similarly with Republicans and the Tea Party side and the moderate side, assuming that still exists, in any particular shape or form.
More and more these days with the rhetoric that is happening south of the border.
So I think that's also partly why we have this ability to have this differentiation in Canada, and parties that rise and merge and fall, or split, rise, fall, recombine in weird ways, because that's also what's happened with some of them, is a result of splintering. And so we will create a new party rather than try and wholesale reform the existing Big Tent party that the Americans have, if that makes sense.
It does actually make sense. And do you think that through the lens of the current global pandemic, do you think that's a hindrance or a help to Canada's agility in responding to, or how's it been so far? What's the report card on the agility of the multi-party system in Canada in responding to the pandemic?
I think it's held out well. We have a lot of hung parliaments across the country right now, both federally and provincially, and that has actually created a situation for cooperation in some cases, because the governing party needs the support of other parties. So it, I think, has made them a little more flexible and a little less doctrinaire in some cases. That they're a little more willing to reach out for support because they know they need it to get passed. To the point where New Brunswick right now is essentially running a unity government, which has its downsides as well, particularly because now there's no one really to hold the government to account. You've got opposition members in the cabinet. So I think that's also, I think possibly one of the upsides is that because just of the way the current landscape has been, that it's forced a little more cooperation among some of these players than it would be otherwise.
That is fascinating, and believe it or not, somehow I have emerged from this conversation with both a deeper appreciation for the complexity of this system as well as a clear understanding of it. So well done on that.
All right.
And thanks for the explanation.
You're welcome, and we'll do it anytime. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.